Robert Bob Michaels, at the age of 65, has found peace in the quiet embrace of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Nestled far away from the hustle and bustle of modern life, he lives alone in a small, rustic wooden cabin, a place that he has made his own over the years. It sits among towering trees, with the air always fresh and crisp, the perfect place to escape the noise of the world below. Having retired years ago, Bob no longer needs to concern himself with the responsibilities of a career. Nor does he feel the pull to be constantly surrounded by people. His days are filled with the solitude he craves, with time to reflect, relax, and enjoy the slow pace of life. Before moving to the mountains, Bob worked as a wildlife rescue officer. His job was one that required both courage and compassion, as he often found himself in dangerous situations, saving animals in distress or helping to rehabilitate those that had been injured or abandoned. The work was exhausting, both physically and emotionally, but it gave Bob a sense of purpose, a reason to get up every morning. Now, however, his mission is more subtle, more personal. Bob's life has become an extension of the love he developed for nature over the years, a commitment to its preservation and to living in harmony with it. He spends his time in the mountains capturing the beauty around him through his camera lens. The forests, the rivers, and the wildlife all play out in front of him like a natural theater. And Bob is content to sit quietly, observing, waiting for the perfect moment to snap a picture. He doesn't care about selling his photographs or gaining recognition for them. What matters is the act itself. Photography allows him to connect with the land and record the fleeting moments of nature's beauty. In a way, each photograph is a small piece of a larger narrative, a love letter to the wilderness that has given him so much peace. In addition to his photography, Bob keeps a daily journal. His writing is simple, yet profound, filled with reflections on the world around him. There is a tranquility in his words, a slow-paced rhythm that mirrors his life. He writes about the changing seasons, the patterns of the wildlife, the way the sun rises over the mountain peaks, and how the cold winter nights make him appreciate the warmth of his cabin even more. His journal entries are a personal record, a space where he can freely express his thoughts and observations. It's a habit that he's maintained for years, and it serves as both a therapeutic outlet and a way to preserve memories that might otherwise fade with time. Bob doesn't seek out the company of others much. The mountains, in their solitude, have become his constant companions. He enjoys the quiet, the stillness of it all. When he ventures into town for supplies, it's always a brief visit, and he looks forward to returning to his cabin, where he can once again find his rhythm among the trees and the animals. His life, though solitary, is full. There's no rush, no need for more than what he has. At times, Bob thinks about the world outside the mountains. He remembers his younger days, the frantic pace of life in the city, the constant demands of work, and the challenges that came with his job as a wildlife rescue officer. But those memories, while meaningful, no longer define him. His time in the mountains has allowed him to shed much of the stress he once carried. And he now sees life from a new perspective, one that values simplicity, quiet moments, and a deep connection with the natural world. For Bob, the act of protecting wildlife has taken on a new form in his retirement. Instead of responding to emergencies, he now seeks to be an observer and a steward, doing his part in his own quiet way. He doesn't belong to any large environmental organizations, nor does he participate in big campaigns. But he's always mindful of the impact his actions have on the environment. Whether it's by minimizing his footprint, ensuring that he doesn't disturb the wildlife, or taking the time to educate others when they visit, Bob believes that every small action counts. His life has become a quiet testament to the power of living in balance with nature. As the years go by, Bob grows more comfortable with the idea of aging. He's seen enough of life to know that time is precious, and he doesn't waste it. There are still days when he feels the weight of loneliness, when the silence of the mountains becomes deafening, but they are few and far between. The peace he's found here, in the company of the trees, the streams, and the wildlife, is a gift he cherishes. It's a life built on simplicity, solitude, and a deep respect for the world that has always been his true home. Bob Michaels has found what many search for their entire lives: contentment. In the mountains, he's free from the noise of the world and the expectations of others. He's simply living, in harmony with nature, with no other goal than to protect and appreciate the beauty that surrounds him. It's a quiet life, yes, but one that is rich in meaning and fulfillment. One quiet afternoon, as Bob Michaels worked around his cabin in the Sierra Nevada, something unusual broke the peace. It was a sound he didn't expect to hear, a high-pitched, panicked cry that echoed through the trees. Bob froze for a moment, listening closely. It was a distressed animal sound, one that immediately stirred memories of his past work as a wildlife rescue officer. He set down the tool he was holding and stepped outside. Following the noise, the call grew louder as he walked towards the source, his boots crunching softly against the forest floor. As he rounded a cluster of pine trees, his heart skipped a beat at the sight before him. There, struggling in the underbrush, was a young bear cub. The poor creature was clearly in pain, its movements awkward and slow as it tried to move with its back leg caught in a steel trap. The trap, designed for larger animals, had clamped down on the bear's leg, and it was bleeding heavily. The cub was desperately trying to free itself, but it was obvious that the injury was too severe for it to manage alone. Bob's instincts kicked in, but so did a wave of uncertainty. He had retired years ago from rescuing animals, and he knew that a situation like this would require careful handling. A level of skill and experience that he had honed over decades but hadn't used in years. Still, the memories of all the animals he had once helped rushed back to him. He couldn't just stand by and let this little one suffer. For a moment, Bob simply watched the bear cub, weighing his options. He had seen many dangerous situations in his time, and he knew the risks involved. A bear, even a young one, could be unpredictable when in pain. But he also knew that if he didn't intervene, the cub's chances of survival were slim. The trap could cause permanent damage to its leg, or worse, the wound could become infected. He took a deep breath and knelt down to assess the situation. His heart was pounding, but his years of experience gave him the clarity to move forward. The bear cub's eyes locked with his, wide and filled with fear. It was clear that it didn't know what to make of Bob. It was a wild animal, after all, and it instinctively wanted to escape. But it couldn't. Its leg was trapped. Bob spoke softly to the cub, trying to reassure it. "It's okay, little one," he murmured, though he wasn't sure the bear could understand him. "I'm not going to hurt you." He needed to stay calm and proceed with care. If he startled the cub, things could quickly turn dangerous. With a steady hand, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't need to call anyone. There was no one nearby. But he did need to think quickly. He looked around for something he could use to help free the bear. The trap was large, and it wasn't going to be easy to remove. Bob had always been resourceful, and his time in the wild had taught him how to improvise. He carefully approached the cub, speaking to it in low, soothing tones. As he reached down to inspect the trap, it was old, rusted in places, but still strong enough to hold the bear's leg tightly. He knew that trying to force it open without the right tools could cause more harm than good. Bob had a few supplies back at the cabin, and he quickly made the decision to go back and grab them. But he couldn't leave the cub alone, not in its condition. He needed to make sure it stayed as calm as possible. Bob had been trained in animal rescue. But this was different. He was alone now. No team. No backup. Just him and the injured cub in the middle of the forest. He stood and moved slowly, backing up a few paces. The cub was watching him closely. But it didn't try to run. Likely because the pain in its leg was too intense. Bob made his way back to his cabin, moving quickly but not too quickly. The last thing he wanted was to startle the cub and make it panic. Once inside, he grabbed a pair of pliers, a heavy-duty blanket, and a first aid kit. He had no illusions about this being easy. But he was determined. He didn't have a choice. Returning to the site, Bob found the cub still in the same spot. But it was starting to weaken. Its body trembled, and the blood from the wound was beginning to pool beneath it. Bob took a deep breath, reassured himself that he could do this, and approached the bear once again. He spread the blanket on the ground and, carefully, he placed it over the cub. His goal was to keep the bear as still as possible, while also providing some measure of comfort and warmth. The bear didn't resist, it was exhausted. Slowly, Bob worked his way toward the trap. The cub looked at him with wide, fearful eyes, but it didn't try to move. It seemed to sense that Bob wasn't a threat, that he was there to help. Bob reached for the pliers and, with a careful grip, began to work on the trap. It was tough, rusted in places, but after a few minutes of delicate work, he managed to loosen the trap just enough to free the cub's leg. The bear let out a low, painful growl, but Bob knew it was just the fear and pain talking. With the trap now removed, he gently lifted the cub and set it on the blanket. The young bear didn't immediately try to flee, though it was clear that it was still in pain. Bob took a moment to inspect the wound, cleaning it as best he could with the supplies he had. He knew that the injury was serious, but with proper care, the cub had a good chance of recovery. Bob knew that he couldn't leave the bear alone now. It needed rest, and it needed time to heal. He looked around and, for a brief moment, considered what to do next. There was no way he could keep the cub in his cabin. But he could keep it safe. The mountains were full of wild animals, and Bob had seen the cycles of life play out in the forest. He would do what he could to help this cub survive. But ultimately, it was up to nature. He helped the cub stand for a moment, ensuring it could move at least a little, before he slowly guided it toward the trees where it might be able to rest. As he watched the bear slowly disappear into the woods, Bob felt a deep sense of satisfaction. It had been a difficult decision to intervene, but in his heart, he knew it was the right one. He had saved many animals over the years, but there was something special about helping this little bear, alone in the wild, with nothing but his own hands and the quiet solitude of the mountains. The peace of the mountains was intact, and for now, so was the life of this young bear. Bob had done his part. Bob Michaels had always lived a quiet, solitary life in the mountains. But when he found the injured bear cub that day, something inside him shifted. It wasn't just the instinct to help. The same instinct that had driven him to rescue animals during his years as a wildlife officer. No, this was something deeper, something he hadn't expected. He had brought the bear cub into his cabin to care for it. And over the course of the following days, a bond formed between them, a bond that would slowly, but profoundly, change Bob's life. When Bob first brought the cub inside, it was weak and disoriented, barely able to move due to the pain in its leg. Bob set up a makeshift bed for it in a corner of the cabin, covering the floor with old blankets and towels to cushion its body. He had cleaned the wound as best as he could, but the cub needed rest. And more than that, it needed care and patience. Bob spoke softly to it, explaining what he was doing as he carefully bandaged its leg and made sure it was comfortable. He had seen many injuries before in his years as a rescue worker. But this one felt different. There was a quiet, profound sense of responsibility he felt toward this animal. It wasn't just an animal in distress, it was a life that needed protection. Just as many had needed him in the past. For the first few days, the cub barely moved, only shifting its position when it needed to stretch or change its resting place. Bob spent his time monitoring the wound, cleaning it regularly, and making sure the cub had enough food and water. But in the quiet moments between caring for the cub, Bob found himself talking to it, as if the bear understood. He would tell stories about his past, about the animals he had rescued over the years, and about the life he had lived before moving to the mountains. He spoke of the wilderness, the beauty and the danger of it, the way the seasons changed and how he had learned to find peace in the midst of it all. The cub, despite its initial fear, began to listen. It would tilt its head slightly when Bob spoke, as if trying to understand. And that small gesture gave Bob a sense of connection he hadn't realized he was missing. As the days passed, the cub began to heal. Its leg started to show signs of improvement, and the cub began to move around more, stretching its limbs and even trying to stand up a few times. Bob kept an eye on it, always ready to offer a hand of reassurance if needed. But he could see that the cub was growing stronger. It would wander around the cabin, sniffing at the walls and occasionally venturing near Bob as if seeking his company. Bob continued to talk to the bear, always in a calm, soothing voice. Over time, he began to feel something shift inside him, a sense of companionship that he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just that he was caring for an injured animal, it was the connection between them. The quiet presence of another living being in the cabin. It was the soft, rhythmic breathing of the bear as it slept near the fire. The gentle way it would nudge Bob's hand when it wanted attention. The small signs of trust it showed as it healed. Bob had spent years living alone. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel so alone. The bear had become more than just a creature he had saved. It had become a friend. A companion in the truest sense of the word. When he looked into the bear's eyes, he saw not just the wild animal it was, but something more, a reflection of his own quiet life. A shared understanding that neither needed to speak to feel understood. The bear's presence had brought a new kind of comfort, one that Bob hadn't realized he had been missing in his solitary existence. The bear, too, seemed to be responding to the care Bob gave it. It was no longer the frightened, injured creature that had stumbled into the cabin that first day. It had grown stronger, its fur becoming shinier, its movements more confident. The cub would occasionally play, clumsily batting at a stray sock or chasing after a small stick that Bob had tossed across the floor. In those moments, Bob couldn't help but smile. It had been so long since he had experienced such moments of joy. And yet here they were, simple and pure, in the form of a young bear finding its way back to health. Over time, the connection between Bob and the bear deepened. Bob would sit in his favorite chair by the window, watching the seasons change outside, while the bear curled up at his feet or beside the fire. He would read aloud to it, sometimes from his journals, sometimes from books he'd kept over the years. The bear didn't seem to mind. Its eyes often closed, but Bob would catch it listening, its ears twitching every now and then as though it were absorbing his words. There was something therapeutic about speaking to the bear, about sharing the quiet moments of his day with another living being who was content to simply be there. One morning, Bob woke to find the bear sitting by the door, looking out at the sunrise. It had been weeks since the cub's injury, and Bob knew it was close to being fully healed. He had never planned on keeping the bear, after all. It was a wild animal, and it belonged in the wilderness. But as he looked at the bear, now strong and healthy, Bob realized that it had become something more than just a creature he had rescued. It had become a friend, a companion that had quietly changed his life. Bob knew that the time was coming when he would have to let it go, to return it to the wild. But he also knew that the bear had become an integral part of his life. The bond they shared had filled something in Bob that he hadn't even realized was missing, a sense of connection, of purpose, and of shared quiet moments. It wasn't the same as the work he had done as a wildlife officer, but it was meaningful in its own way. The bear had become a reminder that even in the quietest, most solitary moments of life, there could still be connections that brought comfort and healing. And as the bear stood at the door, ready to return to the wild, Bob knew that they had shared something important, something that would stay with him for the rest of his days. In the final moments before the bear left, Bob spoke softly to it. "Goodbye, my friend. Take care of yourself out there." And with that, the bear turned and walked into the woods, leaving Bob with a heart full of memories and a quiet understanding that sometimes, even in the most unexpected of circumstances, companionship can find you when you least expect it. Bob Michaels had lived in the Sierra Nevada mountains for many years, finding peace in the solitude of the wilderness. But one morning, as he stepped outside to take in the crisp mountain air, something felt different. The usual quiet was interrupted by an unsettling sensation, a feeling that something wasn't right. As he walked around the perimeter of his cabin, his keen eyes caught sight of something unusual on the ground. There, near the edge of the forest, were fresh tracks, human footprints. They were large, heavy, and deep, suggesting the presence of a person, or people, who had been through recently. As Bob followed the tracks, his heart sank. He noticed something else: scattered traps, the kind used by poachers. Bob's first instinct was to ensure that the bear cub he had cared for was safe. The cub had been healing well, growing stronger each day, and though it was now able to roam around more freely, Bob knew that the wilderness could be a dangerous place for a young animal. It wasn't just the predators that Bob had to worry about, there were people, too, people who cared little for the safety of the animals in these mountains. People who saw the creatures of the forest as nothing more than trophies. Bob's pulse quickened as he thought about the poachers who had left their mark on the land. They were a threat, and he couldn't let them harm the bear. He knelt down to inspect the traps, recognizing them for what they were: steel-jawed leg traps, illegal and cruel. His years of experience as a wildlife rescue officer had taught him the signs of poaching. And the evidence before him was clear. These traps weren't set up for legitimate hunting. They were intended to capture and kill animals for profit. Bob could already picture the kind of person who would do this, a person without any respect for the wilderness, for the creatures that lived there. A person who thought nothing of causing suffering for financial gain. His mind raced with thoughts of what he could do. Bob wasn't one to panic, but he knew he couldn't just sit idly by. The poachers were too close to home, and the bear was vulnerable. He wasn't going to let them harm the animal he had cared for, the one that had become a companion during his solitary years. He needed to act, but he couldn't do it alone. Bob made his way back to the cabin. His thoughts focused on what steps to take next. He needed help, someone who understood the dangers of the mountains and had the authority to deal with poachers. The first person he thought of was Emily Parker, a former forest ranger and a trusted friend. Emily had worked with Bob on several wildlife rescue operations during his time as a wildlife officer, and she knew the area better than anyone. Bob had kept in touch with her over the years, though their conversations were rare, just a check-in every few months. Nothing more, but now, he knew he had to call her. Emily had the experience and the resources to help him handle this situation. And most importantly, She had the authority to deal with the poachers legally. Bob pulled out his old phone and dialed Emily's number, his fingers trembling slightly as he waited for her to answer. The connection crackled for a moment, but then her familiar voice came through. "Bob, is everything okay?" she asked, concern immediately apparent in her tone. "Emily, it's not good," Bob said, his voice low but steady. "I've found signs of poachers around my cabin, fresh tracks. Traps scattered in the forest. I'm worried that they might be after the bear I've been caring for. I need your help." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Emily responded. "I'll be there as soon as I can. You're right to be worried. Poachers like that don't hesitate to harm animals, especially ones that are easy targets. Stay put, Bob. Don't try to handle this on your own." "I won't. I know better than that," Bob said, his voice calm despite the anxiety he felt building inside him. He knew Emily would come quickly, but he also knew that there was a risk that the poachers might act before help arrived. He couldn't afford to wait. "I'll get a team together and be on the road within the hour. You just stay safe," Emily reassured him before hanging up. Bob stood there for a moment, staring out at the trees, his mind racing. He had done what he could by calling for help, but he couldn't sit idly by while the poachers were still in the area. He needed to make sure that the bear, his friend, was safe. It was no longer just about protecting an animal. It was about protecting a life he had come to care for deeply. Bob wasn't just a passive observer of the world anymore. He had become a protector. The thought of losing the bear, after all he had done to help it recover, filled him with a sense of urgency. He couldn't allow that to happen. He made his way back to the cabin, keeping his eyes peeled for any sign of movement in the forest. Every rustle in the leaves, every snapping branch, made him tense, but there was nothing. The poachers had probably moved on for now, but Bob wasn't about to take any chances. He checked the traps again, making sure none were nearby, and then set about securing the area as best as he could. He knew the bear was likely close by, but he didn't want to risk startling it, so he kept his movements slow and deliberate. Bob spent the next hour waiting, his heart heavy with worry. He thought about the poachers, about the destruction they caused, about the lives they would ruin if they weren't stopped. He thought about the cub, the way it had trusted him, the way it had healed in his care. It had come to rely on him, just as Bob had come to rely on it in a way. He couldn't allow that bond to be broken. He couldn't allow anyone to take that away. Finally, he heard the rumble of an engine in the distance. And soon enough, Emily Parker arrived, pulling her truck up to Bob's cabin. She stepped out, her expression serious but determined. "Where are they?" she asked, her eyes scanning the surroundings. "They were here," Bob said, pointing to the tracks in the dirt and the scattered traps. "But I don't know how long they've been gone. I'm worried they're still around." Emily nodded, pulling on her gear and grabbing a rifle from the back of her truck. "We'll find them," she said firmly, "and we'll make sure they don't hurt anyone else." Bob watched as Emily and the small team she had brought with her fanned out into the forest, methodically searching for any sign of the poachers. The tension in Bob's chest slowly began to ease as he knew that help had arrived. But his eyes never left the trees, and his mind never stopped thinking about the bear. He couldn't help but wonder if the poachers were still lurking nearby, waiting for their next opportunity. Bob had made a promise to protect the bear, and now, with Emily by his side, he was prepared to keep that promise, no matter what it took. The time had come. The bear, the young creature Bob had cared for so deeply, had finally healed. Its leg was strong again, its movements agile and sure. The once weak cub had transformed into a healthy, vibrant animal. Bob had spent countless hours watching over it, speaking to it, helping it recover. He had grown attached to the bear, But he knew the time for attachment had passed. The wild was calling to it again, as it always does for creatures meant to roam free. Bob had made a promise to himself and to the bear, to help it recover, but to also let it go when the time was right. And now that time had arrived. Bob had walked the familiar path through the forest many times over the past months, each step reminding him of the place that had become his home. The place where he had spent countless hours in solitude, reflecting on the wonders of nature. But today was different. Today, he was not walking alone. The bear, now fully recovered, walked beside him, its thick fur gleaming in the soft light of the morning. Bob had always known that the day would come when the bear would need to return to the wild. But as he walked beside it, a lump formed in his throat. It wasn't easy, this final goodbye. His heart ached with the thought of the bear leaving him, of losing the companionship that had quietly filled the emptiness in his life. But Bob knew, deep down, that it was the right thing to do. The bear had come into his life as a lost and injured creature, in need of help, and Bob had given it that help. Now, it was strong again, ready to return to its rightful place in the world. Bob had spent many years protecting animals, but this was different. He wasn't just sending the bear off into the wilderness, he was letting it go with a sense of peace, understanding that his role in its life had been to heal, to care, and to help it regain its strength. As they reached the edge of the forest, Bob paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the trees. The wilderness was vast, untamed, and beautiful, just as it should be. The bear stood beside him, looking up at him with an expression that Bob could only interpret as gratitude. Though he knew that the bear's instincts were far more complex than simple emotions. The bond between them had never been about words, it had been about presence. About sharing time together in silence and understanding. And now, that bond was reaching its natural conclusion. Bob crouched down and placed a hand on the bear's head, his fingers gently brushing through its fur. He whispered softly, "You're ready. Go on, little one. You're free now." For a moment, the bear stood still, as if acknowledging Bob's words, its eyes meeting Bob's with a quiet intensity. Then, as if it understood, it turned and walked into the forest, disappearing into the dense trees. Bob stayed still for a long moment, watching the spot where the bear had vanished. It was a bittersweet feeling, a mix of sadness and pride. He had known this moment would come, but that didn't make it any easier. The silence of the forest enveloped him, and for the first time in a long while, Bob didn't feel alone. The bear had taken a piece of his heart with it into the wilderness. But it had also left something behind, a sense of connection that Bob hadn't realized he had been missing all these years. As Bob made his way back to the cabin, the weight in his chest slowly began to lift. He felt a quiet peace settle in his heart, a peace that came from knowing that the bear was where it was meant to be. It was a feeling of completion, of fulfillment. His work with the bear was done, and now it was time for him to return to his own life, to continue his quiet existence in the mountains. But this time, it would be different. Bob had learned something during his time with the bear. He had learned that nature wasn't just a place to exist in solitude, it was a place to connect, to share, and to protect. The bear had shown him that, in ways he hadn't fully understood before. Bob had spent many years living alone, keeping to himself, believing that peace could only be found in isolation. But through his connection with the bear, he had come to understand that true peace came from a deeper connection to the world around him, both the wilderness and the creatures that inhabited it. It wasn't about living apart from others, it was about being a part of something larger, something greater than himself. He had become a part of the bear's journey, and in turn, the bear had become a part of his own. When Bob returned to his cabin, he felt the familiar warmth of the hearth and the stillness of the mountain air. The bear was gone, but the lessons it had taught him would stay with him forever. He made a cup of tea, sitting in his chair by the window, and watched the sun begin to set over the peaks of the mountains. The golden light bathed the forest, casting long shadows across the ground, and Bob smiled to himself. The world was still beautiful, still full of wonder, and he was a part of it, just as it was a part of him. The cabin was quiet, but it wasn't empty. The bear had gone, but the bond they had shared would never truly fade. Bob had found something deeper in those quiet months of caregiving, something that went beyond the simple act of helping. He had found a sense of belonging, not just to the land, but to the creatures that lived on it. He had come to understand that his place in the world was not to withdraw from it, but to engage with it, to protect it, and to share the love he had for it with the creatures who called it home. As Bob sat back in his chair, a peaceful calm settled over him. He felt a sense of gratitude for the bear and for the time they had shared. It had been a time of healing, not just for the bear, but for Bob as well. And though the bear was no longer with him, the lessons of connection, of love, and of stewardship would stay with him for the rest of his days. The wilderness, he now knew, was not a place to live in isolation, but a place to live in harmony with the world around him. And that, he realized, was the truest peace of all.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.